The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of the European Defense Academy, but Claudia Baker had been lying in position since before dawn. Her rifle scope was trained on a target 2,847 meters away, a distance that would soon make military history. But just 18 months earlier, this same woman had scored dead last in her sniper qualification course, missing targets that her classmates hit with ease. Her instructors called her hopeless. Her fellow cadets whispered that she didn't belong. Today she was about to prove that sometimes the biggest failures become the most extraordinary successes. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The Alpine Training Facility stretched across the pristine valleys of northern Austria, where the crisp mountain air carried the sharp crack of rifle fire from dawn until dusk. Established in 1987, the facility had earned a reputation as one of Europe's most elite sniper training centers, producing some of the continent's finest marksmen. The facility's motto, carved in stone above the main entrance, read simply, "Precision through perseverance." Claudia Baker stood barely 5'4" with delicate features that made her look younger than her 22 years. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes held an intensity that most people mistook for nervousness. She had arrived at the facility 6 months ago as part of the German Federal Defense Forces Experimental Integration Program, one of only 3 women selected from thousands of applicants. The other cadets came from impressive backgrounds. Most were former athletes, many had grown up hunting with their fathers, and several had already distinguished themselves in other military specialties. They spoke in confident tones about ballistics and wind calculations, comparing their civilian shooting experiences and debating the merits of different rifle platforms. Claudia, however, had never fired a weapon before enlisting. She came from a small town outside Munich where her father worked as a librarian and her mother taught elementary school. Her previous experience with precision came from hours spent in art class, carefully sketching architectural details, and spending entire afternoons perfecting the shadows in her drawings. While her classmates discussed their hunting trophies, Claudia quietly absorbed every word, taking detailed notes in margins and staying up late reading technical manuals. During the initial assessment week, the differences became painfully apparent. While Marcus Hoffmann, a former Olympic biathlete from Switzerland, consistently placed shots within the inner ring at 300 meters, Claudia struggled to hit the target frame. Elena Vasquez, who'd grown up on a Spanish ranch, effortlessly adjusted for wind and elevation, while Claudia's shots scattered across the range like confetti. Chief Instructor Weber, a weathered man whose reputation preceded him throughout European military circles, watched Claudia's performance with growing concern. After her 3rd consecutive day of failing to qualify at the basic 200-meter range, he pulled her aside during the evening meal. "Baker," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in special operations, "perhaps you should consider transferring to communications or logistics. Not everyone is cut out for precision shooting." The words stung more than Claudia expected. She'd worked for 2 years to earn her place at the academy, scoring in the top percentile on psychological evaluations and physical fitness tests. Her tactical knowledge was exceptional, her dedication unquestionable, but none of that seemed to matter when she couldn't consistently hit targets that her classmates treated as routine practice. That night, she sat in her quarters reviewing her performance logs. The numbers told a stark story. Average accuracy rate of 23% at 200 meters, compared to the class average of 78%. Her groupings were inconsistent, her breathing technique needed work, and her trigger control was, according to her range notes, fundamentally flawed. But Claudia noticed something else in the data. While her accuracy was poor, her shots weren't random. There was a pattern to her misses, a consistency in her errors that suggested systematic problems rather than hopeless incompetence. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching diagrams, applying the same methodical approach she'd used in her engineering courses. The other cadets had natural talent, but Claudia began to understand that precision shooting was as much science as art. Every variable could be measured, calculated, and compensated for. Wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, even the rotation of the Earth, all factors that affected bullet trajectory in predictable ways. The dismissal became more systematic as the weeks progressed. During formation exercises, Claudia was consistently assigned to support roles, while others took point positions. In tactical scenarios, she found herself relegated to communications duty, while her classmates practiced advanced shooting techniques. The message was clear: she wasn't trusted with the primary mission. Marcus Hoffman, who'd emerged as the unofficial leader of their training cohort, made little effort to hide his skepticism. "It's not personal, Baker," he told her after a particularly challenging field exercise where she'd missed 6 consecutive shots at moving targets. "But in the real world, lives depend on precision. We can't afford to have weak links in the chain." Elena Vasquez was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "Maybe you'd be better suited for intelligence analysis," she suggested during a break between training sessions. "You're obviously smart, and that attention to detail could be valuable in other areas." Even Instructor Weber began directing less attention toward Claudia's development. During range sessions, he'd spend extensive time coaching other students while offering her only brief corrections. "Relax your grip, control your breathing, follow through," became his standard advice, delivered with decreasing conviction that she'd ever master these fundamentals. But what none of them knew was how Claudia spent her evenings. While other cadets socialized in the recreation hall or caught up on sleep, she was conducting her own advanced training program. She discovered that the facility's equipment storage included older rifle systems that weren't being used in current training. After obtaining permission from the night duty officer, she spent hours dry-firing these weapons, practicing her trigger pull and sight alignment without ammunition. She also began studying advanced ballistics texts that went far beyond the standard curriculum. Where other students learned basic wind reading, Claudia dove into atmospheric physics. Where they memorized range cards, she learned to calculate trajectory adjustments for any environmental condition. Her notebooks filled with diagrams showing bullet paths, wind drift calculations, and detailed weather observations. The real breakthrough came during week 8, when she began practicing with a .22 caliber training rifle during her personal time. The smaller caliber was less intimidating and allowed her to focus purely on fundamentals without the distraction of heavy recoil. Night after night, she practiced at an improvised 50-meter range behind the maintenance building, using a headlamp to illuminate paper targets. Slowly, methodically, her groups began to tighten. Her breathing became more controlled, her trigger pull more consistent. Most importantly, she began to understand the relationship between her mental state and her physical performance. She learned to recognize and control the micro-movements that threw off her shots, to time her breathing with her natural rhythm rather than forcing an artificial pattern. By week 10, she was consistently hitting center mass at 50 meters with the practice rifle. But when she returned to the official training range with the standard weapons, her performance remained poor. The transition between different systems was proving more challenging than she'd anticipated. The situation reached a breaking point during the midterm evaluation. Each cadet was required to demonstrate proficiency at 400 meters under timed conditions. Marcus and Elena both scored in the expert range, as did most of their classmates. Claudia managed to hit the target only 3 times out of 10 shots, earning a score that placed her dead last in the class. Instructor Weber's patience finally ran out. "Baker, report to my office after the range session," he announced in front of the entire class. The walk to his office felt like a death march, with every cadet watching her retreat from what many assumed would be her final day at the academy. Weber's office was lined with photographs of successful graduates, men and women who'd gone on to distinguished careers in military and law enforcement. Claudia wondered if her photo would ever join that collection, or if she'd become a cautionary tale about the importance of natural talent. "Baker," Weber began, consulting her training file,
Your academic scores are exceptional. Your physical fitness is above average. Your tactical knowledge is impressive. But shooting is what we do here. And frankly, you're not improving fast enough to meet minimum standards. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative.
"Sir," Claudia said quietly, meeting Weber's stern gaze, "I understand that my range performance hasn't met expectations, but I'd like to request one more chance to demonstrate improvement." Weber leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of a man who'd seen countless cadets make similar pleas. "Baker, improvement requires more than good intentions. You've had 10 weeks to show progress, and your scores have actually gotten worse in some areas." "I know, sir, but I've been working on fundamental corrections that might not show immediate results, but could lead to significant improvement." Claudia pulled out her notebook, filled with detailed diagrams and calculations. "I've identified specific technical issues in my shooting platform that I believe I can correct." Weber glanced at the notebook, noting the meticulous detail of her ballistics calculations and environmental observations. The margins were filled with wind speed notations, temperature readings, and mathematical formulas that went far beyond the standard curriculum. Despite himself, he was impressed by the scientific approach she'd taken to solving her shooting problems. "You have 3 days," he said finally. "If you can demonstrate meaningful improvement at the 300-meter qualification test on Friday, you can continue with the program. If not, we'll discuss alternative career paths." Claudia spent those 3 days implementing everything she'd learned during her private practice sessions. She arrived at the range early each morning, spending extra time on dry-fire exercises and breath control. She meticulously recorded environmental conditions, tracking how wind patterns changed throughout the day and how temperature variations affected her rifle's zero. On Wednesday, during a routine training exercise, something clicked. She was assigned to provide overwatch for a tactical movement drill, positioned 250 meters from the exercise area. Her job was to observe and report, not to engage targets, but Weber had placed several pop-up silhouettes throughout the course to test observation skills. As she watched through her scope, Claudia began calling out target locations with precise grid coordinates and detailed descriptions. "Target at grid 247358, partially concealed behind vehicle, approximately 180 meters from lead element." Her reports were more accurate and detailed than those of cadets actually assigned to reconnaissance roles. Marcus, who was leading the ground element, later commented to Elena, "Baker's spotting was incredibly precise. She picked up targets that I missed even when I knew where to look." What her classmates didn't realize was that Claudia's poor shooting scores weren't due to inability to see or identify targets. Her problem had always been the mechanical execution of the shot itself. But her observational skills, honed through months of detailed study and practice, were actually superior to most of her peers. Thursday's equipment maintenance class, Claudia demonstrated another hidden competency. While other cadets performed routine cleaning and basic adjustments, she noticed that her assigned rifle's scope mounting system had developed a subtle looseness that could affect accuracy. She identified the problem, calculated the adjustment needed, and corrected it using techniques she'd learned from advanced gunsmithing manuals. Instructor Weber observed this repair work with growing interest. The mechanical precision and understanding she demonstrated suggested a much deeper comprehension of her equipment than her shooting scores indicated. "Where did you learn to make that adjustment, Baker?" "I've been studying the technical manuals in detail, sir. I noticed that many accuracy problems stem from equipment issues rather than shooter error, so I wanted to understand every component of the system." Weber tested her rifle after the adjustment and found that it now shot significantly tighter groups than before. The improvement was measurable and impressive, suggesting that Claudia had been fighting equipment problems in addition to her technique issues. That evening, Alana approached Claudia in the mess hall. I heard you fixed that scoop mounting problem today. That was actually pretty impressive. I've been having similar issues with my rifle, and the armorers said it was within acceptable tolerances. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Claudia felt like her knowledge was being recognized as valuable. She spent an hour helping Elena diagnose and correct several minor equipment issues that had been affecting her performance. Elena's next day's scores improved noticeably, earning Claudia a grudging respect from someone who had previously dismissed her as incompetent. Word of Claudia's technical expertise began to spread quietly through the class. Johann Müller, a German army veteran who'd been struggling with consistent trigger control, asked for her advice after observing her detailed analysis of shooting mechanics. Claudia walked him through the physics of trigger pull, explaining how different grip pressures and finger positions affected bullet impact. "You understand this stuff better than some of our instructors," Johann admitted, after successfully implementing her suggestions. "How did you learn all this theory?" "I've had to study twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up," Claudia replied honestly. "When you can't rely on natural talent, you have to understand the science behind everything." By Thursday evening, several cadets had quietly sought her advice for technical problems. Her reputation began shifting from the one who can't shoot to the one who understands how everything works. She was becoming the go-to person for equipment problems and theoretical questions, even while her official performance remained poor. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and minimal wind, ideal conditions for the 300-meter qualification test. Claudia lay in position with her newly adjusted rifle, applying everything she'd learned over the past 3 days. Her breathing was controlled, her grip consistent, her mental state calm and focused. She fired her first shot and watched through the scope as it struck the target just outside the center ring. Not perfect, but significantly better than her previous attempts. The second shot was closer to center, the third even better. By the time she completed the 10-shot string, she had achieved a score that placed her in the middle of the class ranking. Weber reviewed her target with surprise. "This is a significant improvement, Baker. Your group size is less than half what it was last week." "Thank you, sir. I believe I've corrected the fundamental issues that were affecting my performance." What her classmates didn't know was that this test represented only the beginning of Claudia's transformation. Her scientific approach to marksmanship was about to prove that knowledge and preparation could overcome natural disadvantages in ways that would surprise everyone at the academy.
The improvement in Claudia's scores didn't go unnoticed, but it also generated skepticism among some of her classmates. Marcus approached her after the Friday qualification test with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. "That was quite a jump in performance, Baker," he said, his tone carrying an undertone of suspicion. "Almost too good to be true. What changed?" Claudia had anticipated this reaction. Outstanding performance after weeks of failure naturally raised questions. "I've been working on some technical issues that were affecting my consistency," she replied, maintaining eye contact. "Sometimes problems that seem like skill deficits are actually equipment or technique problems that can be systematically corrected." Marcus remained unconvinced, but Elena defended her. "I've seen her work. She knows more about the technical side of this than most of us. Maybe she just needed time to put it all together." What none of them knew was the extent of Claudia's hidden preparation. While they saw her modest improvement at 300 meters, they couldn't imagine the advanced skills she'd been developing in secret. During her off-duty hours, she'd been conducting her own extended-range training program, using a combination of borrowed equipment and innovative techniques. The facility's ammunition stores included older surplus rounds that weren't used in regular training. Claudia had obtained permission to use these for independent study, claiming she wanted to understand how different ammunition types affected accuracy. What she actually did was use them to practice at ranges far beyond the standard curriculum. Behind the facility, a series of ridges extended for several kilometers, providing natural backstops for extended-range shooting.
Using surveying equipment from the engineering department, Claudia had precisely measured distances out to 1,500 meters, establishing her own long-range course that existed entirely outside the official training program. Her practice routine began at 4 a.m. each morning, 2 hours before official training started. She'd hike to elevated positions overlooking the valley, set up improvised targets at extreme ranges, and practice the kind of shots that wouldn't be attempted in the academy curriculum until advanced specialization courses. Her notebook contained detailed logs of these sessions, including environmental conditions, ammunition performance, and accuracy data. The real revelation of her preparation came 3 weeks after her qualification improvement. During a weekend navigation exercise, the class was hiking through the same ridge system where Claudia had been conducting her secret training. As they crested a hill overlooking the valley, Johann pointed to a distant rock formation. "What's that white speck on that cliff face?" he asked, pulling out binoculars. "It looks artificial." Elena took the binoculars and focused on the distant target. "It's some kind of paper target, but that has to be at least a kilometer away. Who would put a shooting target way out there?" Claudia felt her stomach tighten as she realized they discovered one of her practice targets. She'd been using white paper plates as improvised targets, and apparently one had survived the weather long enough to be spotted by her classmates. "That's interesting," she said, trying to sound casually curious. "I wonder if it's from some advanced training exercise." Marcus took the binoculars and studied the target more carefully. "That distance has to be over 1,200 meters. We haven't done any training at ranges like that. This is supposed to be basic marksmanship, not advanced sniper work." The discovery sparked conversation about who might be conducting long-range training in the area. Several theories emerged, ranging from special operations units to civilian sport shooters, but no one suspected that one of their classmates was responsible. That evening, Claudia carefully removed the remaining targets from her practice range, realizing that her secret training was becoming harder to conceal. But the accidental discovery had given her an idea. If her classmates were impressed by the theoretical possibility of someone making shots at that range, how would they react to seeing it done in person? Over the following weeks, Claudia began subtly demonstrating knowledge that hinted at her advanced preparation. During discussions about ballistics, she would occasionally mention wind effects or trajectory calculations that applied to ranges far beyond what they'd studied. When the class reviewed weather patterns, she showed an understanding of atmospheric conditions that exceeded the curriculum. Her growing reputation as the class's technical expert provided cover for knowledge that might otherwise seem suspicious. When she correctly predicted how temperature changes would affect their afternoon shooting scores, classmates attributed it to her scientific approach, rather than questioning how she'd learned to make such precise calculations. The breakthrough came during a field exercise designed to test observation and reporting skills. Each cadet was assigned to a different position around the training area, with instructions to identify and report any unusual activity. Claudia was positioned on a hilltop that provided an overview of the entire valley, including areas beyond the normal training boundaries. Through her scope, she spotted movement on a distant ridge that other observers had missed. At first, she thought it might be wildlife, but careful observation revealed a small team of what appeared to be unauthorized personnel conducting their own training exercise. The distance was approximately 1,800 meters, far beyond what most cadets would even attempt to observe in detail. Claudia's report was so detailed and accurate that it prompted an immediate investigation. She'd identified not only the location and number of personnel, but also their equipment and apparent activity. When security teams reached the location, they found exactly what she'd described: a group of civilian sport shooters who'd gained unauthorized access to military land. Instructor Weber was impressed by the quality of her observation and reporting. "Baker, that was exceptional work. How did you manage to gather that level of detail at such an extreme range? I've been practicing long-range observation techniques, sir. I've found that many of the skills required for precision shooting also applied to reconnaissance and surveillance work. Weber's expression suggested growing interest in her capabilities. What kind of range were you observing at? Approximately 1,800 meters, sir. I've been studying how atmospheric conditions affect both shooting and observation at extended distances. The revelation that she'd been conducting observation at nearly 2 kilometers sparked immediate attention. Such distances were typically reserved for advanced sniper training, not basic marksmanship courses. Weber began to suspect that Claudia's abilities might extend far beyond what her official scores suggested. Baker, I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation about your training objectives and capabilities.
The conversation with Instructor Weber took place in his office the following Monday morning. Claudia sat across from his desk, unsure whether she was about to be commended or reprimanded for her unauthorized long-range observations. "Baker," Weber began, consulting her file, "your observation report from Friday was remarkable, but it also raises questions about what you've been doing during your off-duty time." Claudia had prepared for this moment. "Sir, I've been conducting independent study in advanced marksmanship theory and long-range observation techniques. I realized early in the program that I needed to develop a deeper understanding of the science behind precision shooting if I wanted to succeed." Weber leaned forward, his expression serious but not hostile. "Independent study is encouraged, but what you describe suggests capabilities that go well beyond our current curriculum. What exactly have you been practicing?" "Primarily observation and calculation techniques, sir. I've been studying how environmental factors affect both shooting and surveillance at extended ranges. The observation exercise on Friday was an opportunity to test those skills in a practical setting." "And the range at which you made those observations?" "Approximately 1,800 meters, sir." Weber was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "Baker, most of our advanced students don't attempt serious observation work at that distance. How did you develop those capabilities?" Claudia chose her words carefully. "I've been studying atmospheric physics and optical theory extensively, sir. I've also been practicing with equipment during authorized range time, focusing on understanding how different conditions affect long-range work." What she didn't mention was the full extent of her secret training program. The morning sessions, the carefully surveyed distances, the detailed logs of environmental conditions and bullet performance. She'd essentially been conducting her own advanced sniper course while officially struggling with basic marksmanship. Weber stood and walked to the window overlooking the training range. "Baker, I'm going to be direct with you. Your official scores suggest someone who's barely qualified for basic infantry work, but your observation report suggests capabilities that would be impressive in our advanced reconnaissance program. There's a significant disconnect here." "Sir, I believe my shooting problems have been primarily technical rather than fundamental capability issues. I've been working to correct those problems while simultaneously developing complementary skills that I felt would make me a more effective soldier." Weber turned back to face her. "I want to test that theory. This afternoon, you'll participate in an unofficial evaluation. If your actual capabilities match what you're suggesting, we'll need to reassess your placement in this program." The test took place at 1,400 hours on a range that Claudia had never used before. Instead of the standard 300-meter distances, Weber had set up targets at 600, 800, and 1,000 meters. Several other instructors were present, along with Marcus and Elena, who'd been invited to observe what Weber described as an experimental evaluation. "Baker," Weber announced, "you'll have 10 shots at each distance. Environmental conditions are moderate. Wind from the southwest at approximately 8 kilometers per hour. Take whatever time you need to prepare." Claudia approached the firing line with her rifle, the same weapon she'd been struggling with for months, but this time, everything was different. The equipment adjustments she'd made, the breathing techniques she'd perfected, the environmental calculations she'd practiced, all of it came together as she prepared for the first shot. At 600 meters, her first shot struck just outside the center ring. The second was closer, the third centered. By the end of the 10-shot string, she'd achieved a group that drew murmurs of surprise from the observing instructors. Elena whispered to Marcus, "That's not the same shooter we've been training with. That group is better than mine." At 800 meters, the targets became more challenging, but Claudia's performance remained consistent. She took more time between shots, carefully reading wind conditions and making minute adjustments to her aim point. Her shots clustered in a group that would have been respectable for an advanced student. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand what I'm seeing. She's been scoring at the bottom of our class for months." The 1,000-meter targets represented a true test of advanced marksmanship. At this distance, small errors in technique or calculation became magnified into significant misses. Claudia took several minutes to study the environmental conditions, making notes in her notebook before taking her position. Her first shot at 1,000 meters was a hit, not centered but solidly on target. The second was better, the third better still. As she worked through the 10-shot string, it became clear that she wasn't just hitting targets, she was shooting with the precision of someone who'd been practicing at these ranges for months. When the targets were retrieved and scored, the results stunned everyone present. Her 1,000-meter group was tighter than most of the instructors could achieve, and her overall performance placed her among the top marksmanship scores in the Academy's recent history. Weber examined the targets with growing amazement. "Baker, these scores are inconsistent with everything we've observed during your training. How do you explain this performance?" Claudia had decided to be partially honest. "Sir, I've been conducting extensive practice and study outside of official training hours. I felt that my poor initial performance required additional effort if I wanted to succeed in this program." Additional effort is one thing. This level of performance suggests months of advanced training. Where exactly have you been practicing? "I've been using various ranges and training areas during off-duty hours. I've also been studying advanced ballistics and environmental calculation techniques." Inspector Weber studied her with new understanding. "Baker, I think you've been conducting your own advanced training program while we assumed you were struggling with basic skills. Is that accurate?" Claudia met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir. I realized early that I would need to exceed standard requirements if I wanted to prove my capabilities." The implications were significant. Claudia hadn't just been hiding her true abilities. She'd been developing skills that surpassed most of her classmates while maintaining the appearance of barely competent performance. The question now was what to do with someone who had essentially been conducting her own specialized training while officially enrolled in a basic program. Weber's decision would determine whether Claudia's hidden preparation would finally be recognized or whether her deception would result in disciplinary action.
3 days after her disciplinary review, the emergency alert that would change everything pierced the morning quiet of the Alpine Training Facility. At 5:47 hours, the base communications center received a distress signal from a NATO reconnaissance team operating near the Austrian-Italian border. The transmission was fragmentary, distorted by mountain terrain and atmospheric interference, but the message was clear. Contact with hostile forces. Casualties. Request immediate extraction. Major Storm assembled the available personnel in the main briefing room within minutes. The large digital display showed a topographical map of the border region, with a red indicator blinking at coordinates that made everyone in the room grimace. The location was deep in the Ötztal Alps, an area of extreme terrain where helicopter operations were nearly impossible and ground access required technical climbing skills. "The situation is this," Storm announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. "A 4-man NATO intelligence team has been compromised during a border surveillance mission. They're pinned down at approximately 3,200 meters elevation in terrain that our standard rescue protocols cannot reach." Captain Weber studied the coordinates with growing concern. "Sir, that location is beyond helicopter range due to altitude and weather conditions. The terrain maps show vertical approaches exceeding 60 degrees. Standard search and rescue teams would require at least 12 hours to reach that position, assuming optimal conditions. Weather services report a storm system moving in from the west," added Lieutenant Morrison from meteorology. "Visibility will drop to near zero within 6 hours, and temperature conditions will become life-threatening for anyone without proper shelter." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Traditional rescue methods would take too long, helicopter extraction was impossible, and environmental conditions were rapidly deteriorating. The reconnaissance team would likely not survive long enough for conventional rescue operations to reach them. "What about special operations support?" asked Captain Fisher from the training command, mountain rescue specialists with helicopter insertion capabilities. Storm shook his head grimly. "The nearest qualified team is conducting operations in Slovenia. Extraction and deployment would require 8 hours minimum, and that assumes they can complete their current mission immediately." Marcus Hoffman, present as the senior cadet representative, studied the map display with the confidence of someone accustomed to challenging situations. "Sir, what about using our advanced training cadets? Several of us have mountaineering experience and could potentially make faster progress than standard rescue teams." "The approach requires technical climbing at extreme altitude," Weber replied. "Even our most experienced cadets haven't trained for operations at those elevation levels and terrain difficulty." As the discussion continued, exploring and discarding various options, Claudia stood near the back of the room studying the topographical display with growing recognition. The coordinates were familiar, not because she'd been there, but because she'd studied that exact region extensively during her unauthorized training program. The Ötztal Alps had been one of her primary areas of focus when developing long-range shooting skills. She'd memorized the terrain features, elevation profiles, and approach routes while planning hypothetical shooting positions that could provide coverage across the valley systems. Her notebooks contained detailed studies of that specific area, including wind patterns, elevation effects on ballistics, and potential observation points. More importantly, she recognized something that the others had missed. The coordinates where the team was trapped weren't just randomly difficult terrain. They were positioned near what appeared to be a natural shooting position that could provide coverage across multiple approach routes. If the reconnaissance team had been conducting surveillance, they would have chosen that location specifically because it offered superior observation and defensive capabilities. "Sir," Claudia said quietly, stepping forward from her position near the back of the room. Major Storm looked up from the map display with irritation. "This is not an appropriate time for questions, Specialist Baker." "Sir, I believe I know that terrain. I studied the approach routes and elevation profiles extensively. There may be options that haven't been considered." The room fell silent. Marcus turned to stare at her with undisguised skepticism, while several instructors exchanged glances that suggested her timing was inappropriate at best. Weber's voice carried a sharp edge. "Baker, this is a critical tactical situation, not a training exercise. We need proven capabilities, not theoretical knowledge. Sir, I understand the urgency, but I believe I can reach that position faster than conventional rescue teams, and I have the skills necessary to provide effective support once there." The claim drew murmurs of disbelief from around the room. Captain Fisher spoke what many were thinking. "Baker, that position requires extreme altitude climbing in deteriorating weather conditions. Even if you could make the approach, you'd need advanced mountaineering skills and specialized equipment." "I have both. I've been preparing for exactly this type of operation." Major Storm's expression shifted from irritation to anger. "Specialist Baker, you've recently been under disciplinary review for unauthorized activities and questionable judgment. This is not the time to compound those problems with unrealistic claims about your capabilities. I understand your concerns about my recent conduct, sir, but I have the terrain knowledge, climbing skills, and equipment necessary to reach that position. More importantly, I may be the only person here who can provide the specialized support that team needs." "What kind of specialized support?" Weber asked, his tone suggesting skepticism but also growing curiosity. Claudia took a breath, knowing that her next words would either create an opportunity or end her military career. "Long-range precision fire support, sir. If that team is pinned down by hostile forces, they'll need someone who can engage targets at extreme distance while they extract to safer positions." The room erupted in overlapping conversations as the implications of her statement became clear. Marcus's voice rose above the others. "She's talking about sniper support at ranges that exceed anything we've trained for. Even if she could make the climb, she's never demonstrated capabilities at those distances." "Actually," Weber said slowly, remembering her recent demonstration, "she has." Major Storm raised his hand for silence, then fixed Claudia with a stare that felt like a physical weight. "Specialist Baker, are you claiming that you have the capability to provide effective sniper support at the ranges and conditions this mission would require?" Claudia met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir. I believe I do." The silence that followed was only broken by the sound of radio communications from the command center, where operators continued monitoring the deteriorating situation. Finally, Storm spoke again. "Even if your claims about your capabilities were accurate, Baker, you are currently under disciplinary review. Authorizing you for a critical mission would be completely inappropriate." "Sir," Claudia replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing, "sometimes appropriateness matters less than effectiveness. That team is going to die if someone doesn't reach them in time."
The debate in the briefing room intensified as conventional rescue options were systematically evaluated and found inadequate. Captain Weber coordinated with multiple agencies and specialist units, but each conversation ended with the same frustrating conclusion. The timeline and terrain made traditional rescue operations impossible. "Mountain Rescue Services report a minimum 12-hour approach time," Weber announced after ending another radio call. "Weather conditions will make that impossible within 6 hours." Lieutenant Morrison updated the meteorological display, showing the approaching storm system in ominous detail. "Wind speeds are already exceeding safe limits for helicopter operations. Temperature is dropping rapidly at altitude, and visibility is deteriorating faster than initially projected." Marcus Hoffman, despite his earlier skepticism about Claudia, attempted to volunteer himself for what was clearly becoming a desperate situation. "Sir, I have extensive mountaineering experience from civilian climbing. I could potentially make faster progress than standard rescue teams." Major Storm consulted Marcus's file, noting his impressive athletic background and prior climbing achievements. "Hoffman, your civilian experience is notable, but this terrain exceeds recreational climbing difficulty. The approach requires technical skills at altitude levels that present significant physiological challenges." "Sir, I'm willing to accept those risks. That team needs help, and waiting for ideal solutions isn't an option." Captain Fisher pulled up Marcus's physical performance data on the tactical display. "Even with your climbing background, Hoffman, the timeline is problematic. Your best estimated approach time would still exceed 8 hours, and that assumes optimal conditions that no longer exist." Elena Vasquez stepped forward to support Marcus's proposal. "Sir, what if we send a team? Multiple climbers could share equipment loads and provide mutual support during the approach." Weber shook his head after consulting the terrain analysis. "Multiple climbers would actually slow progress on technical sections. The route includes several single-file passages where team movement becomes sequential rather than parallel." The frustration in the room was palpable as each proposed solution encountered insurmountable obstacles. The reconnaissance team's situation was deteriorating with each passing minute, while the rescue options remained limited by physics, weather, and terrain. "What about air support?" asked Captain Mueller from Air Operations. "If we can't extract the team, perhaps we can provide aerial reconnaissance or supply drops." "Negative," replied the meteorology officer. "Cloud ceiling is dropping below mountain peaks. Visibility is already insufficient for safe flight operations in that terrain." Johann Müller, one of the German cadets, suggested a technological solution. "Sir, what about drone reconnaissance? We could potentially establish communications and assess the tactical situation without risking personnel." Lieutenant Morrison consulted his equipment lists. "Our available drone systems lack the range and altitude capability for those coordinates. Battery life would be insufficient for the round-trip flight time required." As options were exhausted, the room's attention gradually returned to the harsh mathematical reality of the situation.
The reconnaissance team was trapped in terrain that exceeded conventional rescue capabilities, facing weather conditions that would soon become lethal, with hostile forces preventing their movement to more accessible positions. Major Storm summarized the situation with military precision. "Gentlemen, we have a reconnaissance team facing immediate threat from hostile forces and environmental conditions. Our conventional rescue capabilities are insufficient due to terrain, weather, and timeline constraints. Unless someone can propose a viable alternative, we'll be forced to classify this as a recovery operation rather than a rescue." The implications of that classification were clear to everyone present. Recovery operations were conducted after personnel were presumed dead, when the mission shifted from saving lives to retrieving remains and equipment. Captain Weber made one final attempt to find conventional solutions. "Sir, what about requesting support from civilian mountain rescue organizations? They might have specialized equipment or local terrain knowledge that could improve our timeline." "Already contacted," Storm replied. "They're dealing with multiple emergency calls due to the weather system. Their specialized teams are committed to other operations, and their available personnel lack the tactical training necessary for a potentially hostile environment." Marcus looked at the map display with growing desperation. "Sir, there has to be something we can do. We can't just abandon that team." "No one is suggesting abandonment, Huffman. But we also can't authorize suicide missions based on good intentions rather than realistic capabilities." Elena studied the coordinates with her own climbing background, trying to visualize alternative approaches. "What if we staged equipment at intermediate positions, created supply caches that could support a faster, lighter approach?" Weber consulted the timeline display. "Equipment staging would require additional personnel and time we don't have. The storm system timeline doesn't allow for multi-phase operations." As the discussion continued, radio updates from the trapped reconnaissance team became increasingly concerning. Their transmissions were growing weaker and less frequent, suggesting either equipment failure or deteriorating conditions. The latest message had been fragmentary: "Taking fire, injuries, limited ammunition." Johann voiced what many were thinking. "Sir, at what point do we acknowledge that conventional methods aren't sufficient for this situation?" Major Storm's response was measured but grim. "We acknowledge that reality now, Mueller. The question is whether we accept that reality or consider alternatives that exceed our standard protocols." The room fell silent as everyone understood the implication. Alternatives that exceeded standard protocols meant unauthorized actions, improvised solutions, or accepting risks that normal military planning would never approve. In that silence, all eyes gradually turned toward Claudia Baker, who stood quietly near the back of the room with her notebook in hand and an expression that suggested she was calculating possibilities that others hadn't considered. The conventional wisdom said that rescuing the reconnaissance team was impossible. But conventional wisdom had been wrong about Claudia before, and the stakes had never been higher for proving that impossible didn't necessarily mean permanent.
Major Sturm's response came with the weight of institutional authority and military regulation. "Absolutely not, Specialist Baker. What you're proposing violates every protocol we have for mission authorization, personnel deployment, and risk management." The finality in his voice should have ended the discussion, but Claudia pressed forward. "Sir, with respect, those protocols exist for normal operational conditions. This situation exceeds normal parameters." "Those protocols exist specifically for situations like this," Captain Weber interjected, though his tone suggested internal conflict. "When we face extreme circumstances, we rely on established procedures to prevent emotional decisions that could make bad situations worse." Marcus stepped forward to reinforce the institutional position. "Sir, Baker has been under disciplinary review for conducting unauthorized activities and misrepresenting her capabilities. Authorizing her for a critical mission would set a dangerous precedent." Moreover, added Captain Fisher, consulting regulations on his tablet, Solo operations in hostile territory require specific authorization levels that exceed this facility's command authority. We'd need approval from regional command, which would require hours we don't have. Elena, despite her previous support for Claudia, voiced additional concerns. Even if Baker's capabilities are what she claims, she lacks the tactical experience for solo operations. She's never been in actual combat conditions. Major Sturm nodded approvingly at these objections. These are exactly the considerations that make Baker's proposal inappropriate. Military effectiveness depends on proven capabilities, not theoretical knowledge or training range demonstrations. Claudia felt the familiar weight of institutional dismissal, but this time lives hung in the balance. Sir, the reconnaissance team doesn't have time for us to request authorization or deploy proven assets. They need help now, from whoever can provide it. That's precisely the kind of emotional reasoning that leads to mission failures, Weber replied. Military decision-making requires objective assessment of capabilities, risks, and probability of success. Lieutenant Morrison added meteorological urgency to the institutional resistance. Weather conditions are deteriorating faster than projected. Even if we authorized Baker's mission, the approach timeline may already be compromised. Johann Mueller, despite his previous questions about conventional limitations, sided with institutional authority. Sir, I understand the desperation, but asking someone with Baker's experience level to attempt a mission that would challenge our most experienced special operations personnel seems unrealistic. The resistance crystallized around fundamental military principles that everyone in the room had been trained to respect. Major Sturm articulated the institutional position clearly. Specialist Baker, the military operates on proven capabilities, established procedures, and appropriate authorization levels. What you're proposing violates all three principles. Furthermore, Captain Fisher added, your recent disciplinary issues raise questions about judgment and decision-making under pressure. Those factors become critical in solo operations where there's no backup or support available. Marcus consulted Claudia's file on his tablet, highlighting specific concerns. Baker's unauthorized training activities demonstrate a pattern of working outside established systems. That behavior becomes extremely dangerous in operational environments. Marcus reinforced the resistance with peer perspective. Sir, I've trained alongside Baker for months. While her technical knowledge is impressive, she lacks the combat experience and proven performance that solo operations require. The institutional wall seemed impenetrable, built from regulations, procedures, and risk-averse thinking that prioritized avoiding failure over achieving success. Major Sturm prepared to close the discussion with command authority. Specialist Baker, I appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but the answer is no. We'll continue exploring conventional options and wait for appropriate assets to become available. Sir, Claudia said quietly, what if appropriate assets never become available? What if conventional options don't work? Are we willing to let that team die because their situation doesn't fit our procedures? Sturm's response carried the weight of military tradition. Sometimes, Baker, we face situations where our options are limited by circumstances beyond our control. Military personnel accept that reality when they volunteer for service. But sir, we do have an option. It may not fit standard procedures, but it exists. An option that requires us to ignore regulations, override safety protocols, and authorize someone with questionable judgment for an extreme risk mission. That's not an option, that's institutional recklessness, Weber summarized. Captain Fisher added the final layer of resistance. Baker, even if everything you claim about your capabilities is accurate, authorizing your mission would require us to violate our oath to maintain good order and discipline. We can't compromise institutional integrity, even for humanitarian reasons. The irony was stark. Claudia's preparation and dedication, qualities that should have made her an ideal candidate for emergency response, were being used as evidence against her reliability. Her willingness to exceed standard requirements was being characterized as dangerous insubordination. Elena voiced a concern that others were thinking. What happens to military effectiveness if we start authorizing unproven personnel for critical missions based on their personal claims about their capabilities? Exactly, Sturm agreed. Military effectiveness depends on predictable, proven, authorized capabilities. We can't make exceptions even when the situation seems desperate. As the institutional resistance solidified into final rejection, radio communication from the reconnaissance team provided a grim counterpoint to the regulatory discussion. Their latest transmission was barely audible. Ammunition critical, casualties increasing, request immediate assistance. The message hung in the air like smoke from distant gunfire, highlighting the gap between institutional procedures and human reality. Somewhere in the mountains, soldiers were dying, while regulations prevented the only available rescue option. Major Sturm prepared to end the discussion with command finality. This discussion is concluded. We'll monitor the situation and provide assistance when appropriate assets become available. But as he spoke, Claudia was calculating the timeline between official dismissal and unauthorized action, wondering if institutional resistance could be overcome by individual determination and the simple reality that sometimes following orders meant watching people die.
The briefing room cleared with military efficiency after Major Sturm's final rejection. Officers departed to coordinate limited support options, cadets returned to their duties, and the weight of institutional authority settled over the facility like morning fog. But Claudia remained behind, studying the topographical display with the intensity of someone calculating possibilities that others had dismissed. The radio in the corner continued its grim updates. The reconnaissance team's transmissions were becoming weaker and less frequent, suggesting either equipment failure or deteriorating conditions. Their latest message had been fragmentary. Taking casualties, ammunition critical, hostile forces advancing. Weber approached her as she stood before the map display. "Baker, I know this is difficult, but the decision has been made. Sometimes we face situations where our options are limited by factors beyond our control." "Sir," Claudia replied without turning from the map, "are you convinced that those limitations are absolute, or are they institutional?" Weber paused, recognizing the deeper question she was asking. "Baker, institutions exist for good reasons. They prevent individual emotions from overriding collective judgment. Even when collective judgment means watching soldiers die?" The question hung between them like smoke from distant gunfire. Weber studied her profile, noting the calm determination in her expression. "What are you thinking, Baker?" "I'm thinking that sometimes institutional wisdom and moral obligation point in different directions." Weber's voice carried a warning tone. "Baker, if you're considering unauthorized action, I strongly advise against it. Your career, your future, everything you've worked for would be at risk." Claudia finally turned to face him, her expression reflecting the weight of decision. "Sir, what's the point of a career if I use it to justify inaction when people need help? The point is serving the larger good rather than individual impulses. Military effectiveness depends on discipline and proper authorization. Military effectiveness also depends on accomplishing missions and protecting personnel. Sometimes those requirements conflict with proper authorization." Weber realized the direction of her thinking and felt obligated to provide final institutional resistance. "Baker, whatever you're considering, remember that you're not just risking your own career. Unauthorized action could compromise this facility's mission and put other personnel at risk." "Sir, I understand the implications, but I also understand that team's situation. They're going to die if someone doesn't act soon." "That's not your decision to make." "Respectfully, sir, it's exactly my decision to make. I can choose to follow orders and watch people die, or I can choose to act and accept the consequences." Weber studied her with growing understanding of her resolve. "Baker, if you take unauthorized action, you'll be completely on your own. No support, no backup, no assistance if things go wrong." "I've been on my own since I arrived at this academy, sir. I'm used to it." The simple truth of that statement struck Weber more forcefully than he'd expected. Claudia had indeed been operating independently since her arrival, developing capabilities that exceeded institutional expectations while receiving minimal support or recognition. "Baker, I can't officially authorize what you're considering, but I also can't prevent you from making your own decisions about how to spend your personal time." The carefully neutral phrasing provided just enough ambiguity for individual interpretation. Weber was walking the line between institutional loyalty and human recognition that sometimes rules didn't cover every situation. Claudia understood the implicit message. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your guidance." As Weber departed, Claudia was left alone with the map display and her own moral calculation. The reconnaissance team was dying, while institutional procedures prevented the only available rescue option. She could follow orders, maintain her standing within the system, and live with the knowledge that people died while she did nothing. Or she could act, risk everything she'd worked for, and at least give those soldiers a chance. The decision crystallized with startling clarity. Everything she'd done since arriving at the academy, the secret training, the equipment modifications, the detailed terrain study, had been preparation for exactly this moment. Not for recognition or career advancement, but for the possibility that her capabilities might someday mean the difference between life and death for fellow soldiers. She pulled out her notebook and began calculating timelines, equipment requirements, and approach routes. The mission would require her to leave the facility without authorization, traverse extreme terrain in deteriorating weather, and engage hostile forces at ranges that challenged even advanced snipers. Failure would likely mean her death and the loss of any chance to help the reconnaissance team. But success would prove that sometimes the most important missions were the ones that nobody authorized. Claudia gathered her personal gear and began moving toward the equipment storage areas. She had approximately 4 hours before the storm system made her approach impossible. 4 hours to prove that preparation, determination, and moral courage could overcome institutional limitations. As she prepared to leave, she thought about the letter she'd written to her sister months ago, explaining why some things were worth the risk. Tonight, she would discover whether those words represented naive idealism or fundamental truth about what it meant to serve something larger than institutional procedures. The reconnaissance team was running out of time, and conventional wisdom said saving them was impossible. But Claudia had been proving that conventional wisdom was often wrong about what one person could accomplish with enough preparation and determination. The only question remaining was whether she was right about her own capabilities, or whether she was about to make the final mistake of a career built on exceeding limitations that others thought were absolute.
The helicopter extraction of Recon Team Alpha took place at 1847 hours, just as the storm system reached full intensity. From her overwatch position, Claudia watched the rescue aircraft disappear into the darkness, carrying 4 soldiers who had survived because someone had refused to accept that saving them was impossible. Her own extraction would be significantly more complicated. The approach route that had brought her to the ridge now presented a treacherous descent in deteriorating weather conditions. With no helicopter support available for her position, she faced a solo climb down terrain that challenged her technical skills, even in ideal conditions. The descent took 4 hours through conditions that tested every aspect of her preparation and determination. Ice-covered rock faces became increasingly dangerous as temperatures dropped and wind speeds exceeded safe limits for most outdoor activities. But Claudia's equipment selections and technical skills proved adequate for challenges that would have defeated conventional rescue attempts. She reached the facility at 0230 hours, exhausted but successful. Her unauthorized mission had accomplished what institutional procedures had deemed impossible. The reconnaissance team was safe, hostile forces had been neutralized, and no additional personnel had been placed at risk during the operation. But walking through the facility gates also meant facing consequences for actions that had violated every protocol governing mission authorization and individual initiative. Major Sturm was waiting in the command center, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. "Specialist Baker," he said quietly, I assume you have an explanation for your absence during a critical operational period. Sir, I conducted an unauthorized mission to provide support for Recon Team Alpha. The mission was successful. All team members were extracted safely. The simple directness of her report seemed to surprise Stir more than elaborate explanations would have. Baker, you're admitting to violating direct orders, conducting unauthorized operations, and potentially compromising facility security protocols? Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for those violations. Weber, who had been monitoring communications throughout the night, stepped forward with radio logs. Sir, we've received confirmation from Recon Team Alpha. Their extraction was successful specifically because of long-range sniper support provided by an unidentified friendly. Without that support, they estimate their survival probability was effectively 0. The implications hung in the air like smoke from distant gunfire. Claudia's unauthorized action had saved 4 lives while violating every institutional protocol designed to prevent such individual initiative. Marcus and Elena, along with other cadets, had gathered in the command center after word of the successful rescue spread through the facility. Their expressions reflected the complex emotions of witnessing someone succeed at something they'd been told was impossible. Major Sturm faced a decision that would define both Claudia's future and the facility's approach to individual initiative versus institutional authority. Baker, your actions tonight were successful, but they were also unauthorized and potentially reckless. How do you reconcile those facts? Sir, I don't try to reconcile them. Sometimes effectiveness and authorization point in different directions. I chose effectiveness. Even knowing the potential consequences to your career and this facility's mission? Sir, some things are more important than careers or institutional missions. Those soldiers' lives were more important. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of her statement. She was essentially arguing that individual moral judgment should sometimes override institutional authority, a position that challenged fundamental military principles. But the successful rescue provided powerful support for her argument. Institutional procedures had failed, while individual initiative had succeeded. The contradiction between military discipline and effective action had been resolved through unauthorized competence. Colonel Richards arrived at the facility the following morning to investigate the incident. His review included detailed interviews with all personnel, analysis of mission outcomes, and assessment of institutional implications. The conversation with Claudia became the focal point of his evaluation. Specialist Baker, your actions raise fundamental questions about military discipline and individual initiative. How do we maintain institutional effectiveness if personnel decide independently which orders to follow? Sir, I believe we maintain effectiveness by developing personnel who can make appropriate decisions when institutional procedures prove inadequate for specific situations. And who determines when procedures are inadequate? Ultimately, sir, the people who understand both the situation and their own capabilities well enough to make informed judgments. Richard studied her with the expression of someone evaluating policy implications that extended far beyond individual cases. Baker, your actions suggest capabilities that exceed your official evaluations. How do we account for that discrepancy? Sir, I believe the discrepancy suggests that our evaluation methods may not capture all relevant capabilities, particularly those developed through individual initiative rather than institutional training. The investigation continued for 3 days, during which Claudia's unauthorized training program, equipment modifications, and preparation methods were thoroughly documented. Rather than finding evidence of misconduct, the investigation revealed systematic capability development that exceeded anything the Academy's official program had produced. The final recommendation surprised everyone involved. Rather than disciplinary action, Colonel Richards recommended that Claudia be immediately transferred to advanced sniper training, with full recognition of her demonstrated capabilities. Her unauthorized preparation would become the foundation for official specialization. Baker, Richards announced during the final briefing, your actions tonight violated established procedures, but they also demonstrated capabilities that our standard programs hadn't identified or developed. Rather than punish initiative that proved effective, we're going to study your methods and apply them to improve our training approaches. 6 months later, Claudia stood on a different range, in a different uniform, with official recognition of capabilities that once had been dismissed as impossible. The record she set that day, a confirmed kill at 2,847 meters under combat conditions, validated every hour of unauthorized preparation and every risk she had taken to prove that limitations were often assumptions rather than absolutes. More importantly, her success had changed how the Academy approached individual potential and institutional flexibility. Programs were developed to identify and nurture exceptional capabilities even when they developed outside official channels. Her story became required study for understanding how individual initiative could enhance rather than threaten institutional effectiveness. The soldier they had dismissed as their lowest performer had become the standard by which exceptional achievement was measured. And somewhere in the mountains, 4 soldiers continued their service because someone had refused to accept that saving them was impossible.